Hello, folks. I think we're going to get started in about 2 minutes. In the meantime, feel free to drop into the Q&A where you are and how you're feeling. Just giving folks a chance to jump in. Q&A is open. Let's use it to chat for a moment. Tell me where you are and how you're doing while we're waiting for folks to jump in. Mitchell, we were in the same class. It's good to see you. Glad it's nice there in Indianapolis. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Meantime, feel free to chat in the Q&A. We got Scott in Prince Edward Island. Sounds nice there. Margaret's in Virginia. Very nice. Southwest Virginia. All right. I think we're going to declare victory. We're going to start right on time. Thank you all so much for coming today. I'm going to talk to you about some radical candor that I got about radical candor. If you write a book about feedback, you're bound to get a lot of it. And this feedback was so meaningful that it prompted me to write my next book, which is called Just Work, although I'm going to share some fast breaking news. The title Just Work just didn't work. So the paperback is going to be called Radical Respect. One of the things that happened shortly after I published Radical Candor was that I was giving a tech talk at a company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech, frankly, in any other sector. And when I finished giving the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to really help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And I also knew how unjust it was. And because she's one of the most sort of even keeled, cheerful people I've ever worked with in my career. And as soon as she said it to me, I had 4 revelations at the same time. The first was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague I had imagined myself. I had failed to be an upstander. I had failed to intervene when she was experiencing this sort of thing. In fact, I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we had ever been in together, even though she had what to be ticked off about in a period of time, as we all do at work. The second thing I realized was that not only had I failed to notice what was happening to her, I had pretended that a whole host of things were not happening to me that were in fact happening. So I had also been in denial about the fact that I was often harmed by different biases, etc., than she was, but biases nonetheless. And there I had an obligation, I think, to choose a response, not to pretend like stuff was was not happening that was happening. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit I had been in denial. But there was something I was even deeper in denial about, because not only was I sometimes the target of stereotypes, sometimes I was the person who dished them out. Sometimes I was the person who caused harm. And as much as I hated to think of myself as a victim, even less did I want to think about myself as a person who caused others harm. But it was my responsibility in those moments, of course, to acknowledge, to be aware. Ignorance is no excuse in this case. And last but not least, I realized that I had imagined myself to be the kind of leader that created these BS-free zones where we could all just get stuff done and enjoy working together. But of course, I had failed to prevent these sorts of things from happening. Excuse me, from happening. And so this really is what prompted me. This moment is what prompted me to write the book, Just Work. Excuse me. It's a good thing we're not in person. I'd be making you all nervous with my coughing. So before we talk about what goes wrong, let's take a moment for positive target identification. What is it that I think we all want from work? We want to work in places that optimize for collaboration. None of us want to be coerced, and we want to work in places that are going to respect our individuality. And I think most of us imagine that we are the kind of people who respect other people's individuality. I've never met anyone who wants to work in some kind of lockstep 1984 style place that's demanding conformity. And yet, this doesn't happen very often. I call it just work, and I'm going to call it radical respect because it is rare. And so what is it? What is it that gets in the way? What gets in the way of just work? I think the core problems are bias, prejudice, and bullying. And one of the issues here is that so often we fail to sort of break this problem apart. We conflate these three problems as though they're the same problem. So the first thing I want to do is offer some super simple definitions, perhaps too simple, but useful in the moment. So bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. When I'm talking about bias, I'm really talking about unconscious bias. Conscious bias, I'm going to call prejudice. This is meaning it. This prejudice reflects some kind of consciously held belief that usually incorporates a stereotype that is both unfair and inaccurate. And last but not least, there's bullying. Usually the driver of bullying is not a belief, conscious or unconscious. It's just being mean. It's sort of an effort to establish dominance over others in some way. Now, what can we do about these things? What's the use of breaking them apart? I think the purpose of breaking them apart is to realize that we need to figure out what to say when you don't know what to say. And you need different problems demand different responses. So let's start with bias. One of my favorite stories about a good response to bias comes from Aileen Lee, who founded Cowboy BC. She was going into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. And Aileen had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she sat in the center, and her two colleagues sat off to her left. And when the other side came in, the first person came in and sat across from the guy to her left. The next person sat across from the guy to his left. And then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. And that's often how unconscious bias shows up, just who we choose to sit next to without thinking too much about it. Aileen started talking, but when the other side had questions, they did not direct them at Aileen. They directed them at her two colleagues who were men. Anyone ever notice that that's the way that unconscious bias shows up, sort of pretending that the person who is talking is not talking. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time, and one of Aileen's colleagues stood up and he said, "I think Aileen and I need to change seats." And that was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. So that's what I call an I statement. And it's worth thinking about, why did he say this? Uh, Part of it was efficiency. It was easier for the people on the other side to hear it from him than it would have been for them to hear it from Aileen. Not because Aileen couldn't speak up for herself. She certainly can, but because it was more efficient for him to say it than for her to say it. The second thing was that he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew if the other side wasn't going to listen to Aileen, they wouldn't win the deal. And then the third thing was that he likes Aileen, he cares about Aileen, and he didn't like seeing her get ignored in that way. So there's sort of a practical side to this, but there's also an emotional / almost moral sense to disrupting bias and disrupting it in the moment. An I statement sort of invites the other side in to notice their own behavior and to notice things from your perspective. It's sort of like holding up a mirror. But if it is prejudice that you're confronting, holding up a mirror will not work, because the other person's going to look in the mirror and grin. They're going to like what they see. They're going to believe. They're going to say, "Yeah, that's what I believe." And so in the case of prejudice, you really need an it statement. An it statement kind of draws the line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't say or do whatever they want to say or do. And it can be hard to know where that line is. So an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So for example, Trier Bryant, a colleague of mine, was in a hiring meeting, and all of the people who had interviewed all the candidates agreed that the most qualified candidate was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally. And so when they thought they were going to move to offer, the hiring manager stopped and said, "Well, we can't extend an offer to that candidate." And, why not? And she said, "Well, because I'm not going to put that hair in front of the business." Astounding that this would happen just a few years ago at a very admired American company. So what's the response? It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state, thanks to the Crown Act. Or it is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. So those are examples of it statements. What about bullying, though? In the case of bullying, you don't want to use an I statement. You don't want to bring the bully closer to you, and you don't want to show someone who's sort of in bullying mode where the line is, because you can be sure they're going to try to push past that line. And so in the case of bullying, you want a you statement. My daughter actually taught me this when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I said to her something that I think a lot of parents say to their kids, "Tell this other child, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah." So I was recommending an I statement. And my daughter banged her fist on the table and she said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?" I thought, that is a really important point. And so a you statement, you can't talk to me like that, or you need to stop now. Or if that feels like it might escalate things too much, you can say, "What's going on for you here?" And by the way, ideally, it's going to be an upstander, not the target of the bullying who responds. Or even a you non sequitur. "Where'd you get that shirt?" It sort of distracts the person. And it also puts you not in the submissive role, but in the active role. So let's pause for a moment and think about what you can do as an upstander in order to sort of use these I statements, it statements, you statements, because it's easy to think about how to do this directly. But if we think about the number of times we've seen people get ignored in meetings, like in the Aileen Lee story I just told you, it's pretty hard to think about how to respond in the moment directly. So that may be your ideal response, but it also may not be. I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote Just Work is in gratitude for all the upstanders who helped me throughout the course of my career. And the last thing I want to do is put upstanders in harm's way. So sometimes direct is not the best thing to do, but you can create a distraction, sort of. That's the where'd you get that shirt? There's a story about Snack Man where there was an altercation on a subway, and somebody just threw their potato chips on the floor to allow the person who was the target to get away. You can also delay. Just checking in with the person who was harmed by the behavior later can be really an important thing that you can do as an upstander. There was one time in my career where I was introduced. I was giving a talk with two colleagues who were men, and the head of the organization that we were speaking at was introducing us. Introduced the first guy, shook his hand, introduced the second guy, shook his hand, introduced me. And I stuck my hand out expecting for him to shake it. And instead he grabbed it and kissed it, kind of licked it. Sort of one of those cringe moments. And that was bad. That was really gross. But what was worse is that there were 500 people in the audience. Not a single person came up to me afterwards and said, gosh, that was weird. Are you okay? So checking in with the person is actually a great way to intervene as an upstander, because it dispels gaslighting. When nobody said anything, I thought, gosh, was I the only person who thought that was disgusting? So check in with folks. You can also delegate. There's been a lot that's written about the bystander problem, and you can avoid the bystander problem by asking someone else to intervene who may be, for whatever reason, in a better situation to intervene. And last but not least, document. Obviously, the documentation that you use, it is the property of the person who was harmed, not you. So check in with them before you use that documentation. Now, it shouldn't also be all up to the upstanders to intervene. Leaders have got to take some steps to make responding to bias, prejudice, and bullying expected, so that we can minimize these things. We're going to either get more of these things if we ignore them, or less of these things if we start to take action. So what can leaders do about bias? I'm going to talk more in a moment about bias disruptors, but the point of bias is that if you point it out in the moment, you're not shaming someone, but you're correcting a bad pattern. When we ignore bias, when we notice bias in a meeting and we ignore it, we're actually reinforcing it. So it's important to learn how to disrupt it in the moment, but in a way that disrupts the bias, not the whole meeting. In the case of prejudice, it's really a leader's responsibility to create a space for conversation so that people understand where that line is between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose it on others. What counts as imposing your belief on others? It's really easy for me to sit here and talk about that line. It's really hard for you to figure out in your organization where that line is. And last but not least, bullying. It's so important for leaders to create consequences for bullying. Conversational consequences. You got to learn how to shut it down in the moment. You got to learn how to take the platform away from the person who is indulging in bullying. You've got to learn how to create sort of compensation consequences. You don't want to allow people who indulge in bullying to get high ratings and big bonuses, because then you're just going to get more of it. If you reward bad behavior, you're certainly going to get more of it. Atlassian has a really good rule in their 360 process that there's no brilliant jerks. We're not going to encourage the brilliant jerk. We're going to hold them accountable for their behavior as well as for their output. Last but not least, career consequences. You do not promote people who engage in bullying. I think there comes a moment in every team's history when the assholes begin to win. And that is the moment when the culture begins to lose. So make sure that you are, if you're the leader, that you're creating real consequences for bullying. I want to double click on the notion of bias disruptors. There's 3 steps to disrupting bias. The first one is to come up with a shared vocabulary. And if you're the leader of the team, do not don't sort of impose words on your team. Ask your team what is the word or phrase that they can agree that they will use when they notice bias in their interactions with each other. I like to use a purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not a red flag. It's not a yellow flag. It just is an educational tool. But other teams have said they really don't like the purple flag. In fact, I work with IDEO, and this does not meet their design standards. So we're working on something better. Other teams I've worked with have thrown up a peace sign. Some teams say bias alert. Some teams adopt some of Daniel Kahneman's language. But the point here is that you need to have a shared vocabulary so that people can know what to say when they don't know what to say. So talk to your team. The next thing that you need to do is create a shared norm. Create a shared norm, because I don't know about you, but when someone tells me that I have said or done something that is biased, I feel deeply ashamed. And I'm rarely at my best when I feel deeply ashamed. So, as a leader, you want to teach people how to move through that shame, how to own the shame, move through it, and get your executive function back on track. So, you want to teach people to say, "Thanks for pointing it out." Either I get it or I don't get it. Now, I get it is pretty hard to say, especially when we are changing sort of deeply ingrained bad habits of thought and speech, especially speech. There are certain words that we grew up saying that we can no longer say. And it can be hard to change that vocabulary. I was working with one CEO who tended to refer to his whole team as you guys, and he was trying to change it to you all, but that did not fall trippingly off his tongue. He really had to work hard to change his vocabulary. So that is hard. We need to be patient and persistent with ourselves and with others. But being patient doesn't mean not holding ourselves and others accountable. But what do you do when you don't get it? Because I don't know about you all, but for me, when someone points out that I've done something that's biased, but I don't know exactly what the bias is, now I feel doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've hurt someone else, and I am ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. Getting people to push through the discomfort of those moments is really important. So I don't get it, but can you talk to me after the meeting? And the reason to talk about it after the meeting and not during the meeting is because the promise here is that we're going to disrupt bias. We're going to do it often, but we're not going to disrupt every meeting. And the reason it needs to be fast is we need to have a shared commitment that we're going to embrace the discomfort of these moments. We're going to build stamina in order to learn how best to speak with one another, how best to talk to one another, how best not to use these. We all have these red words, which if there's certain things, if you say to me, I'm not going to hear another word you say. And I think everyone has those words. So we need to learn how to become aware of that, and not to keep trotting on these raw nerves that we all have. And that means we need to do this often, like almost in every meeting. If you get to the end of a meeting and nobody has flagged bias, it probably means that either you didn't notice something that it would have been better to notice, or you didn't feel comfortable. You hadn't built the stamina for it. So what I would love to do now is to pause. There's more to the there's more to this, because obviously things get much worse when power enters the equation. But I want to give folks a chance to ask questions. I'm looking at the questions now. I'm not seeing any questions, but I bet there's going to be some in a second. I'm going to count to 10. What I'm seeing here is that we're from all over the country, which is cool to see. All right, I'm gonna talk for a moment about what happens when power enters the equation. And I hope that folks will feel free to ask a question or will jump in. Feel free to interrupt. Just ask questions at any point. Okay, what happens when power enters the equation? Things go from bad to worse. Unchecked power creates the conditions for illegal behavior. What creates the conditions for discrimination? Bias or prejudice plus power create the conditions for discrimination. And often this is almost like unconscious discrimination. It is these unconscious biases, when we put them into practice in our hiring practices, in our promotion practices, in giving people ratings, then we discriminate, and we're maybe either unaware or sort of strategically ignorant about what's happening. Harassment is what happens when you layer power on top of bullying, and then it's much harder to deal with. Last but not least, physical violations. This is what happens when you layer power on top of touch. So let's sort of think about what can we do to prevent this kind of illegal behavior. We need to quantify our bias. We need to measure what matters at every stage of the employee life cycle. We need to make sure that we are taking a look at the numbers and cutting it by demographic. And I don't think it makes sense to start with hiring. Start with pay. You can use pay scale or other. There's a lot of tools out there that will help you cut your pay data by demographic and identify areas where you may have a pay gap that does not reflect people's contribution to your company, but rather it reflects bias in the system or in the people who are using the system. If you don't design your systems specifically to be fair, then you're going to wind up with systemic injustice. So you want to take a look at pay. You want to take a look at promotion. You also want to take a look at more subtle things like, for example, mentoring. Who is getting mentored? Who is not getting mentored? I've spoken with Evan Cohen, who led a law firm, and he realized that sort of privilege was compounding because the people who were the partners were primarily white men, and they were primarily mentoring white men, and he just asked people to be more conscious of it, and managed to fix the problem pretty quickly by sort of forcing people to quantify the way that bias was playing out in their mentoring decisions. So take a look. And this kind of bias quantifier doesn't have to be super sophisticated math. I'll tell you a story at the end about a CEO I worked with, and he noticed there were no women on his team. Like, he did not need some complicated system in order to notice that. Harassment. Here you need to make sure that there are checks and balances. When a leader has too much unchecked power, or really any unchecked power, that is the moment when power begins to corrupt. And it doesn't, some of the most productive teams I've ever worked on are teams where there was someone like Shona Brown at Google, for example, who systematically stripped unilateral decision-making power out of all the management systems. So you couldn't, no matter who you were at the company, you couldn't hire whoever you wanted, you couldn't fire whoever you wanted, you couldn't pay whatever you wanted, you couldn't promote whoever you wanted. There were systems, because it turns out that in these kinds of decisions, we make better decisions as teams than we do as individuals, because we're more likely to notice someone else making a bad decision than we are our own. And we're less likely to abuse our power if there are checks on it. Last but not least, physical violations. What you really need to do is create a culture of consent. All I mean by a culture of consent is simply to recognize, to have a shared recognition that nobody has the right to touch anyone else, even for a handshake. Rather, if you want to instigate any kind of touch, it's your responsibility to know if the other person wants to be touched. And if you're not sure, don't touch. And if you're too drunk to know, definitely don't touch. So that, and we can actually use the moment in history that we're in at right now, where we're coming back to work, we're figuring out how to re-enter the workplace, do more in-person gatherings. And let's rethink the handshake, because after COVID, some people are okay shaking hands again and other people are not. So use that as a way to learn how to ask it, would you rather a handshake or elbow bump or whatever it is, to be more aware of a culture of consent and whether people around you want or don't want to be touched. I want to leave you with the exhortation, let's work better together. We can work better together. I think we're at this moment in history when we've become more aware, thanks to Me Too and Black Lives Matter, we've become more aware of the problems. And the worst thing we can do is to duck back into denial. The worst thing we can, and it's an uncomfortable moment, but the only way out is through. I was just rereading Oedipus Rex, and when he realized that he had done something wrong, he gouged his eyes out. And that is not what we need to do at this moment. Let's simply take a deep breath and work better together. Thank you so much. There's another minute left. So if anyone has a question, I am happy to answer it. Somebody said, appreciate any tips on how to point out bias and discrimination in online groups without getting them to further dig in to their existing bias and even defending it. I think it can be very helpful to start out assuming that it is bias. If you, and saying, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Try the I statement. I have been pleasantly surprised on social media at how open people are. And I've also been pleasantly surprised at how willing people are to tell me when I have made a mistake in my language. And so try that I statement and then notice what happens next. I'm gonna wave the purple flag on myself. Often I use the word see when what I mean is notice. Somebody else said, do you have any advice for introducing the concept of a purple flag on a team? How to present the idea successfully? Yes, context is really important. There, if you do a quick Google search, I'll drop this into the chat. There is a TED Talk that Trier Bryant. So search for Kim Scott, Just Work TED Talk. And you'll see that Trier Bryant and I did this talk together. And we really outlined how and why to use the purple flag. You can play that and then talk to each other. I know that we are 1 minute past time. I'm going to keep answering questions until they shut me down. Okay. Sometimes it seems we introduce deliberate bias in our attempts to create timely and effective response to other biases. What are your thoughts? So I think that this question about deliberate bias I think what this person means is we're trying. For example, there was a team at a tech company that I know about, and they were trying to check out what if women were over or underrepresented in promotions. And they would give the team a red flag if women were underrepresented, but not if they were overrepresented. And that I think is I mean, I think it should go both ways. There could be a reason. In other words, we're making up for past underrepresentation, but I think it's important that that we are fair, that we create systems that are fair to everyone. I think that's what that question means. But feel free to write me, radicalcandor@radicalcandor.com or hello@justworktogether.com if I misunderstood. Another question is, to take the example of Aileen, should we think about anticipating bias, for instance, in the way we choose to sit at a meeting? I think that it is important to be aware of who you're choosing to sit next to, and to be also aware that stereotype threat can, because we're afraid, because I, as a white person, may be afraid of being accused of racism, I may then do the racist thing. So an example of this is in an experiment that Claude Steele ran. He describes this in his great book, Whistling Vivaldi. And he told a group of white students that they were going to talk about affirmative action. And then he had them set up chairs in anticipation of the discussion. And when the white students thought they were going to be speaking to Black students about affirmative action, they actually set the chairs up further apart. And I think his interpretation of this is that this was a stereotype threat. So they were afraid that they were going to be accused of racism. And then because of that fear, it actually caused them to sit further away instead of leaning into the conversation. So I think that is really important to be aware of and to manage against, because what you want to do is, especially when it comes to sitting with people, but also in terms of feedback. I get versions of this all the time. Like, I'm afraid to give feedback to someone who's different from me along some dimension. And if you're the boss, you know what? It's your job to give that person feedback. So it's your responsibility to overcome that discomfort. And I think it's also important in this regard to understand the difference between discomfort and unsafe. Like, being uncomfortable is not unsafe. That's how we learn. And the only way we're going to learn and grow is to embrace that discomfort, I think. There's another question. What was the most compelling question that led you to write this book? I think it was really that story of Michelle, who is the Black CEO, who pointed out that it was much harder for her to put radical candor into practice than it was for me. And that caused me to, realize that I had, by not considering explicitly that would be the case, I was putting her in a jam. And I also realized not only was I putting her in a jam, I'd also put myself in a jam, because frankly, it was harder for me to put radical candor into practice than it was for a lot of the men who I worked with. This is an important question. What do you do when your boss is the bully? What you do when your boss is the bully? Start by documenting. Not even if you have no intention of suing or using this documentation. Documentation, the most important use of documentation in my mind is to dispel gaslighting. So document. Look for solidarity. Look for there's so much evidence that if you have one or two people who you trust at work who you can go and share thoughts with, that is really another really important way to dispel gaslighting. Third thing I think that we should all do when our boss is the bully, and by the way, it's much more likely that your boss is going to be the bully than that your peer is going to be the bully, because power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. A little bit of power corrupts a little bit. So I think it's important to locate the exit nearest you. I want to acknowledge that there are times when we are well and truly stuck in our job, but I think very often we feel more stuck than we in fact are. So if you take the time and effort to kind of explore what your exit options are. Is there another job you could get? Then you're going to be able to respond much more clearly. So if you find that, you know what, I could get another job, it can be easier to go and talk directly to your boss. I've coached so many people who felt bullied by their boss, and when they went and shared this feedback with their boss, they got a great response. That's not always going to happen, but it'll very often. In the no asshole rule, Bob Sutton writes about the bona fide assholes and the temporary assholes. And very often people, when they become managers, wind up sort of falling prey to the stress of the job and to the power that they get. And they start acting like jerks without being aware of it. When they are aware of it, they change their behavior. So, and it's a much safer conversation to have if you know you can quit if they don't respond well. I think it's also worth considering talking to HR. Usually, I mean, HR is supposed to be part of the solution here. And very often HR is part of the solution. Some of my most close working relationships are with HR professionals. So I have enormous respect for the function. And I want to, at the same time, acknowledge that there are companies where HR is more interested in protecting your boss than in protecting you. So make sure you understand the dynamics of the situation. But even if you're in a situation where HR is not representing your interests and is just trying to protect the boss bully, it is important, if you want to either take legal action or share publicly what's going on, it's important to report to HR. I talked to Susan Rigetti, then Susan Fowler, about why she kept going to HR at Uber, given that they had demonstrated they were not going to help her. And she said that was essential to explaining why the problem was not just a couple of bad actors, why it was a systemic problem. So if you try talking to your boss directly, talking to HR, and things get worse, you suffer retribution, then you know it's time to go. You can also at that point contact a lawyer or write your story. I think one of the things that gives me some hope in this moment is that it is so much easier to tell your story publicly and to have people believe you. Now, that's not to say that they often will, but it is more likely to happen now, I think, than it was 10 years ago. There's another question that says, what happens when there's a lack of consensus between members of marginalized groups over whether a word or its alternative is offensive? This is tricky. So I, for example, really don't like to be called a girl. I'm an adult and I want to be referred to as a woman, but not all women feel that way. And I acknowledge that. So I think the important thing is not to look for absolutes here, but to respect what an individual, how an individual wants to be referred to. That's more easily done when you're talking about a small group of people. If you're, I struggled with this when writing the book because I was writing for everyone. And sometimes you just have to do your best. I mean, and sometimes you're going to mess up. And I think the important thing there is to be open to the feedback when you mess up. So for example, in Just Work, I chose to use the terms overrepresented and underrepresented. And I've gotten a lot of feedback that those were not the right terms. People didn't like being called either one of those things. And so in the paperback, I am making different choices. I think the important thing here is to remember, like, and that was uncomfortable for me, but I was not in any way unsafe as a result of, we can't let our fear of making a mistake prevent us from talking openly. And sort of the key to this is that you can make a genuine mistake and you can fix that mistake. And that's how we learn. If we think about it as math, nobody is going to learn math without making some math mistakes along the way. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing to this work a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset. How does an upstander be direct? I think that the most important thing to do, when I mean direct, is to point out the problem to the person who caused the problem. That's what I mean by direct. And that's not always the best way to approach it. So that's why that's why I share the other D's. And by the way, I did not make the 5 Ds up. That comes from an organization that used to be called Hollaback and is now called Free to Be. So check out their website. All right, I think we're now 13 minutes over time. So I am going to call it. I'm going to say thank you all so much for the engagement. And I am eager to chat with you all more. Keep in touch. hello@justworktogether is the best way to reach out to me. Or you can send a note to radicalcandor@radicalcandor.com. Thanks.